Welcome everyone to our STAMPS webinar series. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Matthias Katzfuss. Matthias is a professor in the Department of Statistics at University of Wisconsin-Madison. He received his PhD in statistics at the Ohio State University, and he was faculty at Texas A&M for several years before he relocated to Wisconsin-Madison. And as you may know, Matthias' research expertise include computational spatial and spatial temporal statistics, of course, Gaussian processes, uncertain quantification, and data assimilation, with applications especially to environmental and satellite remote sensing data. And today, Matthias will talk about his work on non-Gaussian emulation of climate models via scalable Bayesian transport maps. So Matthias, please take it from here.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. Great to be able to give my talk here through Zoom today. So I will talk about essentially something that we call Bayesian transport maps and how we can use them to learn the distribution of spatial fields with climate models as sort of a main motivating application. So we'll start with an introduction. So climate can be considered as a distribution, and then the weather is sort of an observation of that distribution that we actually get to observe, a sample from that distribution. And similarly, we can think of climate models as encoding a distribution, and every time we run a climate model forward with slightly different perturbed initial conditions, we get a sample from this distribution that is encoded by the climate model under particular settings and the particular emission scenario and so forth. And so here's an example of log precipitation rates on the globe that are output by a climate model. Here on the globe, we have a grid of total size of 55,000. And what we would like to do is we would like to learn this distribution that's encoded by the climate model from a very small number of samples. Climate models are very complex, numerically expensive models that have to be run usually on supercomputers, and so it costs a lot of energy and time to do that. So you often only have very few samples, if you will, from this distribution that the climate model encodes. And we would like to learn that distribution from a very small number of samples. So capital N is going to be sort of the number of spatial locations, or the dimension of the distribution that we're trying to learn. And then we have a small n, which will denote the number of samples that we have from this distribution. And we're going to be operating in a regime where the large n might be on the order of tens of thousands, say, and the small n might be on the order of less than 100. So this is a very challenging problem. But of course, if we are able to learn this distribution well, then we can do many things with it, like impact assessments for what the climate model is saying. We can calibrate the climate model and many other things. So it's sort of a challenging problem, but one that if we can solve it would be very useful. So as I said, this is a challenging problem. If we have a spatial distribution, like on the previous slide, you might want to consider some techniques from spatial statistics to solve this task, but many of the at least very standard approaches from spatial statistics are probably not very applicable here. So if we're looking at something on the entire globe, we're going to tend to see non-stationarity here. The dependent structure may also be non-parametric in the sense that there's no real reason to assume that the dependent structure that we're seeing here would have a Matern form or anything like that or any other parametric standard covariance model. And on top of that, the dependent structure may be nonlinear, implying that the joint distribution is non-Gaussian. And of course, there's a computational problem associated with all of this as well if we have a very large n. And so this is a challenging task, and of course, there's many techniques out there that address at least some of these challenges, but few that address all of them. And we're going to specifically talk about, as I mentioned earlier, Bayesian transport maps as a potential way to address these challenges and sort of learn a high-dimensional spatial distribution from a small sample. So we'll start with just sort of introducing what transport maps are, and then our Bayesian version of transport maps more generally, and then I'll talk about specifically how we do this in the context of spatial distributions, where we can exploit sort of spatial structure to really scale this to high dimensions. So in this subsection, we're just going to assume that y, the vector y consisting of y1 up to y capital N, is just a zero mean continuous random vector. For example, it could be a spatial field at n locations, but again, for this subsection, it doesn't necessarily have to be. And so we're not going to assume this here, but just as a motivating sort of example, if y did follow a Gaussian distribution with some covariance matrix sigma, then it's well known that if we take the inverse Cholesky factor of sigma, what I'm calling L here, then if we pre-multiply y by L, basically L maps y to a standard Gaussian distribution. So what that implies is sort of, we could characterize this normal distribution by its covariance matrix, or we could equivalently characterize it by this inverse Cholesky factor that maps a sample from this general normal distribution to a standard normal. Now, again, we're not going to assume normality here, but instead we're going to just say, well, we have some distribution of interest P of y, which may or may not be Gaussian. And then we can sort of extend this idea that I have here to this more general non-Gaussian setting by saying we now have a nonlinear, not a linear map, but a nonlinear transport map that I'm calling T, that also characterizes this distribution in the sense that y, if y is a sample from this sort of general non-Gaussian distribution P of y, then T of y is a sample from our reference standard normal distribution. Here's an illustration of that. I just made up some bivariate distribution here. You see the contours. So this is very clearly non-Gaussian. That could be, for example, our P of y. And then we might learn a transport map that essentially maps this complicated distribution to a standard normal. And the inverse of this map would take us from the standard normal distribution to this distribution of interest, this target distribution P of y. Similarly, if we think of now a sample y from our unknown distribution P of y, here now going to this 55,000 dimensional example that we saw earlier, this climate model output, then we could use this transport map to transform this sample from this complicated distribution to a sample that I'm calling Z here from a standard normal. So these are just sort of 55,000 IID standard normal variables that are or samples, these little black dots here. And then another nice thing is if we have the inverse of the map, we could also sample from Y by sampling Z, which is cheap and easy. We can sample IID standard normals very easily, even lots of them, and then use this inverse transport map to map this to a sample from our target distribution P of Y. So that's written down here. We can sample from our distribution of interest by just sampling from the standard normal and then applying the inverse map. Another nice thing that we might want to do with transport maps that I'm not going to talk too much about here is that we could also take this like non-Gaussian Y, map it to Z, and then do operations on Z that linear operations that might be more meaningful to Z than to Y. For example, if we're averaging over things or doing some kind of linear transformation, we might want to apply that to Z instead of Y. But again, I won't talk about that too much here in this talk. Okay, so I motivated the transport map with a Cholesky factor. Now, Cholesky factors are triangular matrices. Similarly, we can assume without loss of generality that the transport map is lower triangular in the sense that the ith component of this function only depends on the first I entries of Y in whatever ordering of Y we've chosen. So for example, the second entry only depends on Y1 and Y2. So that's without loss of generality. In addition, we're going to assume here that each of these components, each of these functions here, Ti, is linearly additive in its ith argument, in its last argument, and but it can be sort of any function of the other arguments. If we make this assumption here, then it's relatively straightforward to show that the implied density of Y, so the P of Y that is implied by this relationship here, can be written in this product form here, where we have normal distributions for each yi, where the mean of the normal distribution depends in some potentially nonlinear way on the y's that are ordered previously, y1 up to yi minus 1, and then we have some variance term di squared there. So if we sort of view the distribution from this perspective, what we then basically have to do is we have to identify this fi, and we have to identify this di for I equal 1 up to n, where fi is a function from r I minus 1 to r. So this could be potentially fairly high dimensional here when we have a large n, and therefore the I could also be large. But this is sort of nice in that we've now turned this problem of estimating this n-dimensional, potentially complicated distribution P of y into just n independent regressions of yi on the previously ordered y1 through yi minus 1. So we have regressions here of this form, where we have this regression function fi, and then the di square is sort of the variance of the error term. And that's nice in the sense that we just have n regressions, and they're independent, and statisticians sort of know how to handle regressions and different techniques that we could use there to handle that. Most existing transfer map approaches, there's a review paper by Yusuf Marzuk that's very nice on that topic. They typically estimate parameters in a parametric map. So they say T depends on some finite number of parameters, some small number of parameters. We estimate them from data, and then we just plug them in, and then that's our estimated map. And then we sort of say, well, that's what characterizes our distribution. But there's not really any uncertainty quantification of the estimation uncertainty in those parameters. We're gonna, or in a paper that we have that I'll show at the end, we proposed a Bayesian approach to this, where we said, well, we're going to put independent Gaussian process inverse gamma priors on these fi's and di squares. We're going to make that assumption. Now, how exactly we do that, as I said, I will say a little bit more about that, how we do that in the spatial context in the next subsection. But the nice thing about this sort of general kind of a prior on this fi and di square is that is a Gaussian process prior on fi, for example, is a non-parametric prior. So that means as we get more data, we can learn more and more complex functions without changing our prior. And it also allows us sort of to shrink toward things that we might find desirable. And so specifically, we're choosing a prior here that shrinks toward a linear function. As I said, if we have a linear transport map, then of course that implies joint Gaussianity. So that's maybe something natural to shrink toward. And then, of course, these prior distributions on the fi and di square, they induce prior distributions on the ti's. And then that means we also now have essentially a prior for this entire map, for this entire function t. Important reason why we chose these particular sort of class of priors is that they are conjugate, and that leads to closed form expressions, as we'll see on the next slide. So what happens now is that we have a model now. What if we have training data and we want to fit the model to that? So let's say now we have capital Y here consisting of y1 up to yn that are our samples from the distribution of interest. Here now I'm making explicit that this is conditional on the f and d. Then we can think about, okay, that we have a model, we have data that implies now a sort of posterior predictive distribution for y, where we condition on what we've learned from the training data, capital Y. And we can think about a map, a transport map that I'm calling T tilde here, that characterizes this posterior predictive distribution, again, in the sense that if we have a sample here, Y star, from this posterior predictive distribution, T tilde maps this sample again to our reference standard normal distribution. So we're calling this T tilde here the posterior map. So that's a useful thing to have then. It characterizes this posterior predictive distribution. And it turns out it's also sort of something that we can compute easily and has nice properties. So in particular, it's also a triangular map, and the components, the T tilde i's, can be obtained just using Gaussian process prediction. This is sort of a ugly looking expression here, but you don't need to sort of understand all the details of it, but it's just basically saying there is a closed form expression, and the components that the elements that we need within that, for example, this vi and this fi hat, they're just quantities obtained by very simple standard Gaussian process prediction. So just using well-known formulas for the multivariate normal distribution. So they can be computed in closed form and very easily also in our setting. We also can evaluate the inverse of this posterior map T tilde by recursively solving this system of equations here for any given Z star and solving that for Y star. And so we just basically have to sort of compute this yi star here in this recursive manner for I equal 1 up to n. Again, don't worry about the details of the notation here, but this is just, again, to say that we can do this in closed form. Now, we have these Gaussian process inverse gamma priors on the Fi and Di. Those priors can, of course, also depend on parameters, regarding these hyperparameters theta here. So there's a question of what do we do with these potentially unknown, with this potentially unknown theta. But the nice thing is that, again, due to the conjugacy of these priors, we can get a closed form expression of the integrated likelihood P of y, where the Fi and the Di square are integrated out now, as a product over n closed form terms, capital N closed form terms. And now, of course, we can use that integrated likelihood to do whatever inference we might want to do for these thetas. So, for example, we could do empirical Bayesian inference where we just optimize over the thetas, or we could do some sort of fully Bayesian inference where we sample the theta using, for example, Metropolis Hastings based on this integrated likelihood. The way we usually do this is we just do optimization. And the nice thing is, because this P of y is a product of terms, its log is a sum of terms, and it turns out that this optimization can be done very nicely using stochastic gradient descent. Okay, so again, this previous subsection was sort of a general idea for modeling not continuous but potentially non-Gaussian distributions. Now we're going to focus on the case where we're modeling a spatial distribution, the distribution of a spatial field. So now we're assuming that, again, we have this vector y, y1 up to yn, but now we're assuming that these are sort of observed at corresponding locations in space S1 up to Sn, where yi, the ith entry of this vector, is some spatial process y evaluated at a corresponding spatial location Si. So here's as an illustration here, I think it's 30 by 30 grid on a square. These little gray dots would be sort of the spatial locations at which we might have observed this. This is on a regular grid, but our methodology does not require things to be on a regular grid. Just for illustration here, a regular grid. So spatial distributions are often fairly high dimensional, and that, here even on a little sort of, for example, we saw earlier this 55,000 dimensional setting from the climate model. So, if we're looking at a lot of points in space, we very quickly have a very high dimensional distribution that we have to potentially estimate. But the nice thing is we can exploit that spatial structure, and that's what we're going to be doing in the next couple slides. So the first thing is to say, well, we have some sort of triangular structure like we have for that transport map, that implies that some ordering has to be chosen. And so we have to figure out how do we order y1 up to yn, but we're going to simply do that based on ordering s1 up to sn. So we're going to choose the ordering of the entries of y based on the corresponding locations. And specifically, we're going to use something called a maximum minimum distance ordering. What this does is we start with some point out of our, here, as I said, I think 30 by 30 grid. So there's 3,600 points. No, is that right? No. 60 by 60 grid, 3,600 points. So we start with some location, let's say the one in the center. And then as the next location in the order, so that will be our first location in the ordering. Then as the next location in the ordering, we choose whatever has the maximum minimum distance to what we've chosen so far. So that might be maybe up here. And then we choose sort of the corner points. And then we always choose each point to maximize the minimum distance to all the points that were previously chosen. And what that does is, if we look at this sort of as a function of I, if we look at the first I locations in the ordering, we get sort of denser and denser grids over our spatial domain. Again, looking at the first I locations in this maximum ordering here for I equal to 13, 51, 290, you can see things are getting denser and denser and denser. And so these regression problems that we mentioned earlier here, these are basically now in the spatial context, we can think of them as spatial prediction problems. So we want to then predict essentially what's going on at the ith location, which is this blue cross here, or blue plus in all of these panels, from the circles, which are the previously chosen, previously ordered variables. So we basically have to sort of predict what is going on here given the circles. And as I said, we're getting denser and denser grids. So if we look at the minimum distance of the ith location to the previously ordered locations, we're calling that Li here. So this is this red line. You can see that Li is getting smaller and smaller. So we basically have these prediction problems on finer and finer scales. And it turns out, there's sort of a systematically decaying scale for these prediction problems. So this minimum distance Li here, you can see these red circles here. So they sort of decay as I increases, and in particular they decay at a particular rate depending on the dimension of the spatial domain. So here in 2D, they sort of decay as 1 over square root of I. And what we're going to do is we're going to sort of exploit this decaying scale in that it turns out for a large class of processes that we might be interested in, specifically those with quasi-quadratic log likelihoods, it turns out that you can show that things become more and more Gaussian as you go to larger I. So if you look at the conditional distributions of something given the points that are previous in the ordering, things become more and more Gaussian, even if the original distribution, the original process, was not Gaussian. And so we use this sort of result as a motivation for the priors that we put on our FIs and DIs, specifically in the sense that we do now assume that they are, no, we're not assuming, but we're motivating these priors by the behavior that a Gaussian field with a Matern type covariance would have. If we did have a Gaussian field over space with a Matern type covariance, we see a certain behavior, and we use that behavior to inform our prior distributions. Again, motivated by the fact that things sort of become more and more Gaussian for a large class of processes, even if they are not completely Gaussian. And so what happens for a Gaussian field with a Matern type covariance for this DI and FI? Well, specifically for the DI, they decay polynomially with Li. So you can see here in black, the black dots are the DIs as a function of I, and then this is the red line is sort of something times Li to the power something, where that something is fitted to the data, and we get sort of roughly that decay. So we use that to essentially inform our prior for the DI. And then more importantly, for, again, a Gaussian field with Matern type covariance, the influence of the kth nearest neighbor decays rapidly. So here we see that illustrated numerically. The effect of the kth nearest neighbor in our spatial prediction problems, specifically we're looking at mean squared weights here in a linear regression, because in the Gaussian case we have a linear setting. You can see as a function of k here very quickly this effect or the effect or the influence of the kth nearest neighbor goes to essentially 0 very, very quickly. And that is really sort of what allows us to scale the really large n of 55,000, say, is that we can then, because of this fact, we can sort of say, well, then let's only consider the m nearest neighbors and achieve sparsity in that way, where m is some small number that we actually let the data decide what m should be. But it's often estimated to be, 5, 10, maybe 20, not more than that in most cases if we have a 2D spatial field. So this is illustrated here. As we said, we have essentially this spatial prediction problem where we're trying to predict what happens at the blue cross from all the black circles, but it turns out that we probably don't have to consider all the black circles. We don't need to really know what's happening out here if we're trying to make a prediction here. It's enough to condition on, say, the here m equal to 4 nearest neighbors, maybe m equal to 10, but often not much more than that. And so we could consider only here, for example, these green exits. And if we do make that sparsity assumption, then that things only depend on the m nearest neighbors, then the computational complexity, for example, for inference, for example, evaluating the integrated log likelihood, turns into sort of capital N problems that are each only of sort of very small size. So the complexity for each of the individual problems is like n to the small n to the cubed plus m times small n squared, where m is this number of neighbors that we've chosen or the data have chosen. And then the lowercase n is the number of samples that we have. But as I said, we typically assume that to be quite small, like less than 100. And these capital N problems here, these capital N computations we have to do, they can be done in parallel, or we can do mini batching, as I mentioned earlier, over those. Okay. Now, so far, we've basically developed methodology that can be used to very flexibly model the dependence structure between different components or elements in Y, specifically non-Gaussian, or sorry, non-linear dependence structure. So that implies non-Gaussianity, of course, for the joint distribution. But the focus has been sort of on this dependence structure and not so much on the marginal flexibility. And so there's ways of sort of extending this approach that I talked about so far in various ways to get to a point where we also are quite flexible, or at least we can handle marginal distributions that are potentially far from Gaussian. One way would be to say we just marginally transform each of the yi's with some function, say gi, to be more Gaussian, and specifically in that for these precip anomalies that I showed earlier that we'll come back to later, we use a log transform to make them roughly Gaussian. But we also, in the paper that I'll again bring up later, we developed a way to do sort of a Bayesian non-parametric inference on the model regression error terms, on the regression error terms, and model those using Dirichlet process mixtures with Gaussian-based measures. So that gives us a lot of extra flexibility, but it comes at a cost of having to do MCMC. There's no closed form transport map anymore. It just becomes a lot more expensive and complicated and ugly to handle. But that would be one way of doing this. And I'm also currently working with a student on sort of other ways that are sort of also quite flexible, but maybe not as computationally cumbersome to increase the marginal flexibility. Okay, let's look at some numerical comparisons. We'll start very simply with just a simulation setting where we just simulate spatial fields from a Gaussian distribution with exponential covariance. So this is sort of maybe the most standard model from spatial statistics with a Gaussian process with an exponential covariance. And here we have it on a grid of size n equal to 30 by 30, so 900 dimensional distribution that we're interested in. The cool thing is, though, that actually only the first 4 plots here, the first row, are samples from this Gaussian distribution that I just mentioned. And the second row samples are actually samples from our transport map model that I introduced previously that is fit to samples or where the training data are samples such as this from the actual Gaussian distribution. Yeah, this is trained on, I think, a couple dozen samples. And I would say, at least to me, if I sort of just permuted all these plots in some way, I wouldn't be able to tell which one was sampled from the actual, true distribution here, this Gaussian distribution with exponential covariance, and which ones were sampled from the transport map. Just as a sort of quick comparison, we also tried to fit a VAE to this, admittedly small sample from a Gaussian distribution, and you can see that it's producing samples that look almost nothing like what it should look like. So it's definitely not capturing that distribution very well. Clearly the scaling is already off quite a bit. But even if we sort of correct for the scaling here to make the marginals sort of roughly on the same range, you can see the spatial structure also doesn't look right. Similar picture if we look at actual climate model output. So this is actually the same precip anomalies that I showed earlier, but now we're just focusing on or zooming in on a small region over a portion of the Americas instead of the entire global field. Again, here's the actual climate model output training data. And then here's our transport map that's trained on, again, a couple dozen, I think, of training data like this. And you can see, at least, yeah, again, to my eye, it's not sort of immediately obvious which one is from the transport map and which one's from the training data if I didn't have the information about which row it is in here. And then, again, as a comparison to that, VAE, even a scaled version, doesn't have the right structure at all. Here's a more systematic comparison where we're using the log score. So essentially approximation to the KL divergence up to a additive constant. for different methods as a function of the ensemble, the training ensemble size. So, if we have only 10 training samples, we can sort of achieve this kind of KL divergence. And if we get more and more samples, we can achieve better and better, lower and lower KL divergences. We compared sort of a lot of methods here. I will just point out maybe a couple that might be interesting to discuss or look at. The black line is essentially a linear version of our approach, where we fix all these FIs to be linear, sort of getting toward a Gaussian distribution. Although this black line does also account for uncertainty in the estimation. If we don't account for the uncertainty, then we would get that red line up here that's way up here somewhere. For small ensemble size, that would be very bad. As sort of a external competitor, a local Matern fit. So where we sort of do little windows, and in each little window we fit a local Matern. We can get roughly sort of a similar KL divergence as with this linear version of our transport map. So this sort of means like, this is probably about as good as we can get with a Gaussian assumption, with an assumption of linear dependence. Then in green we have, this is sort of the transport map approach that I've talked about now most of the time. And in this light blue, this is the same thing, but with this Dirichlet process mixture extension on the error terms, where we get added flexibility in the error terms. And this actually does better, at least once we get to maybe 20 samples or so, training samples. This actually gets a lower KL divergence, but as I said, it comes at the cost of lots and lots of additional computation and sort of not closed forms expressions and so forth. This is on this Americas subregion that I just showed here. This panel is the same thing, but with fewer methods, because most of the methods just not feasible to fit on the global scale on the entire globe. So this is on the exactly those data sets that I showed at the very beginning of the talk. But here now, just comparing the nonlinear, like the Bayesian transport map that I talked about, to a linearly restricted version of that. And we can see, we can get, again, quite an improvement by allowing things to be nonlinear, the dependence to be nonlinear. I will sort of not say too much about this last plot, but this is basically a posterior median of the DIs as a function of I, of the maximum ordering index. And these drop off very quickly. So what this sort of shows is that we can capture most of the variation with early ordered coefficients, and we can sort of use this kind of approach then as a version of nonlinear principal components if we have non-Gaussian fields. But I won't talk about this too much here in this talk. Instead, I'm going to talk a little bit about some extensions that we have worked on and recently and are still working on of this sort of basic transport map approach that we saw so far. First thing is, this is actually completed work that's already published, where we're extending this to multivariate spatial fields. So instead of just having a single spatial field, we saw those precip anomalies a couple times now. Here we're looking at multiple spatial fields, and we're trying to model them jointly. So as an example here, we have precip in the first column, soil water content in the second column, and runoff anomalies, in the third column. From the CSM large ensemble project, we have here just 4 samples, but of course we can get more. It's just for illustration. There's 4 samples that are sort of in some sense from the joint distribution. So these 3 samples here in the first row belong together. There's sort of 1 sample from the joint distribution encoded by climate model, and the second, and so forth. And so we would like to now, again, from a very small number of samples, a very small number of rows here, learn the joint distribution for each of those spatial fields, but also jointly for the 3 different variables that we have in this case: precip, soil water, and runoff. The way we do this is, roughly speaking, to apply the same techniques as before, but now in sort of an extended space. So here we can say we have sort of 2 spatial dimensions, if you will, let's say longitude and latitude. And now we're adding potential dimensions to that to say how far processes are apart in some latent space. So here's an illustration of this if we had 1D space, 1D here on the x-axis. So let's say we just have 1D space, and we have 2 processes. We can think of these 2 processes as being sort of separated in some latent dimension, which is on the y-axis here. And if they're sort of, far from each other in this latent dimension, that means they have not that strong dependence, and the dependence is stronger within each process. or we could have a setting where the two processes are very strongly dependent, and we have potentially sort of a lot of cross-dependence relative to the amount of dependence we have within a process, within one of these lines. So we have to essentially determine what this process position or the position of the processes is in this latent space. And then if we have that, then we just do our Maxmin ordering and our nearest neighbor conditioning in this extended space that is actual geophysical or actual space in physical space, and consists also of any potential latent dimensions that we use to denote how far the processes are apart. In the case when we have only two processes, this is of course very simple. It gets more complicated as we go to, say, p processes where p is greater than 2. And then specifically, if we have p processes, we use essentially a p minus 1 dimensional latent space to characterize how closely any sort of pair of processes is dependent, how strongly it is dependent. So here's an example of what we get when we estimated something like this for the 3 variables that we have here: precip, soil, water, and runoff. The position of the precip, that was just arbitrarily chosen as the first variable in our ordering, as the first variable here, we fix that position, and then we essentially estimate the position of the other 2 processes, soil, water, and runoff, relative to that, here based on an ensemble of size 38. And this is sort of over 10 cross-validation splits, so you can see we sort of roughly get the same position in each of those CV splits. And then we have here now basically a 2-dimensional latent space, and we have a 2-dimensional physical space. So now we do our Maxmin ordering and nearest neighbor conditioning in this 2 + 2 or 4-dimensional space. And then, after that, we essentially just apply the same model as before, some very minor modifications. And that's what we did here. So now we have the first 3 columns here are the same as what I showed here. So these are just sort of an example of training data, or in this case, actually, these were held out as test sets, but the training data would look very similar. So with those first 3 columns here are output from climate model. And now what we did is we trained our transport map on similar samples to this. I think, as I said, 38. And now we look at these test samples here, and we say, let's assume that we don't know the runoff, but that we do know precip and soil water. And then we sort of take the learned distribution in our transport map and compute the conditional distribution of runoff given precip and soil water. So we hold this third column out, and then we essentially try to, for example, sample from the conditional distribution that is to get something that is ideally going to represent that third column, or look similar to that third column. And so that's what we have here in these columns, 1, 2, 3. So each of these columns here are samples. Let's say, for example, this one here is a sample from the conditional distribution of runoff given this particular precip field and given this particular soil water field. And then the same thing for this, same thing for this. And then this last column is just the mean of this conditional distribution for runoff given this particular precip and this particular soil water. And so, again, visually, I would say this doesn't look too bad. So the next question then maybe would be, how does this compare in terms of a more systematic comparison, numerical comparison? And so what we did here, again, we considered different training ensemble sizes, 10, 20, 30, and 38. And then we essentially looked at the log square. Again, you can look at this as scale divergence, but this is actually, unfortunately, flipped. So higher is better here. You can think of this as sort of negative scale divergence or an approximation thereof. Sorry that this plot is oriented the other way. So higher is better in this plot. And we're comparing our multivariate transport map, the sort of reddish color, to just a parametric method, which here is just a Matern GP that we fit to the same data and then try to compute the same conditional distribution for runoff given precip and soil water. And you can see as we get more training data, our multivariate transfer map is sort of able to get better and better scores relative to this parametric method, which, it's very parametric, so it's not going to improve all too much anymore once you have a certain number of samples. So even if we had 200 samples, we'd probably still get fairly similar scores as we do here with the parametric method, but our method sort of improves as we get more and more samples. Okay, so that would be one project that is actually completed. Here's an extension that we're currently working on. And I'm seeing I'm starting to run out of time now a little bit. I was too overconfident in how much time I had. So here's an extension that we're currently working on, where we're trying to learn conditional distributions. So we have this spatial field Y, say, and now we assume we have some covariates, or they could be parameters of the climate model, or emission scenarios in the climate model case. And we're trying to learn the conditional distribution of Y of the spatial field given some vector of covariates X. The way we do this, it's a lot more complicated than that, but essentially what we do is we have these regressions that I talked about earlier in the case without covariates, where we're regressing Yi on nearest previously ordered neighbors. Now we're including X in these regressions. Again, it's quite a bit more complicated than that. It sort of brings with it a lot of wrinkles, but that's the basic idea for how we learn or try to learn conditional distributions. Here's an example of a Matern covariance again, or a Gaussian field with a Matern covariance. So now we are saying our conditional distribution Y given X, it's for any given X, it is a normal distribution with mean 0 and a Matern covariance, where X is the log smoothness in that Matern covariance. And we're just fixing the variance and the range parameter in this Matern. So essentially the X is the log smoothness, but of course our model does not know this, not any of this. It's just saying I'm observing for different smoothnesses, for different X's basically. I'm observing training samples like we have here in the first row. And now I'm going to simply learn what this distribution is, the spatial distribution is as a function of this X, as a function of this log smoothness, given the training samples that I have. And it turns out that we can actually, at least in this simple example, we can do this with on the order of 10 or 20 training samples only. And then we can sample from our model, from our transport map model, again, for any sort of new any smoothness that we're interested in. So here are some independent samples for different values of the smoothness parameter. And because we have this transport map expression, we can also say, well, let's just simulate a particular Z from a standard normal and transform that using our posterior map, which now is a function of X because we have this conditional distribution as a function of X. And we can transform the same Z that we've simulated using T tilde X inverse of Z for different X's. So for X corresponding to smoothness 0.1, smoothness 0.25, and so forth, and sort of essentially take the same field and modify its smoothness. Again, without the transport map actually knowing that this is just the smoothness parameter in the Matern. It's learning all of that just from the data.
So Matthias, you can still take 10 minutes, so no need to.
Okay, yeah, I mean,
because
maybe
it's interesting.
5 more. I will probably maybe 5 more minutes or so. Sorry for sort of taking too much time on some of the earlier stuff. Okay, so where was I? Yeah, so this is sort of again, I'm not giving you a lot of the details here, but we have this technique now, which we have not fully finished a paper yet, but it exists, and we can apply this now to different settings. And once we can learn these conditional distributions, that actually allows us to do a lot of cool stuff, I think. For example, we're working on a paper where we're using this in the context of calibrating models whose output is spatial and in some way uncertain, so stochastic. So basically, climate models, again, are motivating examples. So let's say we're trying to calibrate a climate model. And we said earlier, we can think of a climate model as encoding a distribution. Every time we run it under a particular setting, we get a sample from this distribution. Now, if we assume that, well, or not just if we assume, but a climate model will have unknown parameters, right? And they need to be calibrated. And I'm calling these parameters here X. And now we can think about, a climate model now basically for each X, for each parameter value, it encodes a distribution, and that distribution may change in for very complicated ways as x changes, as the parameters that I'm putting in, the parameter values are changing. And so we want to calibrate this climate model by finding the parameter value, say x star, that most closely matches the climate model distribution to the true climate that I'm calling pi here. So we're thinking of, like, there's the true climate out there in nature, and we're trying to calibrate our climate model such that we match the climate model distribution as closely as possible to the true climate by sort of modifying this x and choosing the value of x that matches it most closely. For example, we could be doing this in terms of just minimizing the KL divergence between the true climate distribution pi and the climate model distribution px as a function of x. This minimization problem is equivalent to this maximization problem here, where we have an expectation with respect to pi. Now, of course, we don't know what pi is. There is some true climate out there, but we don't know what that is. So all we can sort of do essentially at that point is to essentially replace this expectation with this observed vector y star that we've actually observed from the true climate. So we have sort of one true observation of the climate, the actual weather that we've observed, the actual weather trajectory, based, in historical data up to now. And so we just make that replacement and sort of approximate that expectation in this way. Now, that is, of course, a little bit simpler optimization problem now than the one on the left, but it is still a very complicated optimization problem in that px is unknown, at least sort of, we don't have any analytical form for it. And sampling from it is also very, very expensive. As I mentioned, every time we sample from a climate model, every time we run a climate model, costs a lot of computation time and energy and so forth. So we would ideally like to do this sort of using as few samples from the climate model as possible. And so the idea would then be to use our transport map or the estimate that we get for this distribution of y given x, that I'm calling p tilde y given x here, as a surrogate for this optimization problem. Here's a sort of illustration of what that might look like in this setting here. So we have these Matern fields. X determines is the log smoothness of the Matern. And now we train the transport map sort of on the order of 20 Matern fields for different x's. And then we assume we have now a new observation, y star, which is from from a Gaussian with a Matern covariance, but with a particular x star that we don't know. We're trying to learn that using our surrogate. So we can look at now the learned log score, log of p tilde y star given x, and look at where is it maximized, or what does it look like for different pairs of x star and y star. So let's take, for example, this one here. Here, we've set the true x star to be log of 1.5, so the true smoothness is 1.5. We take one sample from a Gaussian with a Matern covariance with smoothness 1.5, and take that to be our y star. And then we look at this thing here, log of p tilde y star given x, as a function of x, or as a function of the smoothness. And we can see it's actually roughly maximized at the true value, which is this black vertical line here. And then these blue lines are sort of different. If we repeat this process over and over, we get different curves. But roughly speaking, they all have their maximum very close to the true value. And we can do this for different smoothnesses, 0.1, 0.25, and so forth, up to very large smoothness. And roughly speaking, the surrogate seems to, at least in this simple example, work quite well. So what we could do then is to essentially, like we did here, we choose 20 values for x on a grid. We sample correspondingly from our climate model, which here, of course, we just had this Matern model, but could be a real climate model. And then we fit to that, and then we have a surrogate, and then we maximize that surrogate and choose that where the maximum is. We say that's our x star. We can also do this sort of in a more maybe sample efficient way, which is to do active learning. So now we can do this sequentially maybe. Let's say we've observed k training data already. And here in this example, you're starting, I guess, with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those green stars here. So let's say we're starting with 5 training data. We train our transfer map, our emulator p tilde on these training data. And then we think about, okay, where do we want to sample next on what would be the x-axis here? Which x do we want to sample next? Maybe that would be promising. And so we obtain a new training sample y, say k+1 at px y. at the value of x that, for example, maximizes the surrogate log likelihood, or maybe even better, that either maximizes this or maximizes the discrepancy between the surrogate and the true distribution. Now, this is, of course, again, very complicated because we don't know the true distribution, and this is something we're still working on, but we have started implementing this idea just based on this exploitation. So where we literally at each step simply choose the value where the surrogate is maximized, and that's where we sample next. And so this is, again, in this Matern example that I showed a couple times now. So we start with these 5 points here, and then we choose the next point. So the y-axis here is basically x. Should have labeled this. And then here are the iterations. Essentially, the k in this notation here is on the x-axis. So we start with these 5 samples, these green stars. Then we choose the next point, the next x value at which our surrogate is maximized. That happened to be this value here. Then we train our surrogate again on these 6 samples that we have corresponding to the first 6 stars here. Then we again choose the x that maximizes the surrogate log likelihood, and we keep going like this. I can see here again in this simple example, we've essentially found what the sort of correct, the best value of x is, the x star, which is this red dashed line, horizontal line, after maybe 7 or 9 iterations, depending on how you look at it. So again, this looks quite promising, at least in this simple example. Okay, I will conclude briefly here. So we infer non-Gaussian distributions via a Bayesian transport map. We have lots of flexibility there in terms of the dependent structure. It's a non-parametric approach where as we get more and more data, we get sort of better log scores, better KL divergences. We learn more and more. We have this nice probabilistic regularization, and we essentially account for the uncertainty in terms of integrating out the Fi and Di and accounting for the estimation uncertainty in the transport map. For spatial fields in particular, we have this data-dependent sparsity, this M parameter that we let the data determine, and that allows us to scale to really high dimensions. For those of you familiar with vector approximation of Gaussian processes, that's something I've worked on a lot. You can think of this as sort of a Bayesian, non-parametric, and non-Gaussian extension of vector approximations. I want to acknowledge some funding from NSF and NASA. And then maybe just mention again here, we have these extensions. I showed you the multivariate extension. We're also working on a space-time extension and other things along those lines. And then we're working on this sort of conditional distribution learning when we have covariates X, so that we can interpolate between observed covariates, or we can use it as a surrogate for calibrating parameters X in a climate model, say. Let me briefly talk about this slide here. So most of the talk, the sort of basic transfer map, this is all in this paper here with Florian Schäfer from Georgia Tech. We have a paper on the linear Gaussian case, a special case that we wrote earlier, the student Brian Kidd. The multivariate extension is already published. That's with Paul Wiemann, the postdoc here in my group. And for those of you interested in data assimilation, I didn't talk about this at all in this talk, but you can actually use a lot of the techniques that I was talking about here in the context of ensemble-based data assimilation, ensemble common filters. We have a paper on that uses this linear case in an ENKF, and I'm happy to talk more offline about that. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Matthias.